these two hooks that we have created are almost identical. So let me show you how to create a generic data fetching hook. So here in the hooks folder, we add a new file called useData.ts. Now let's go to use genres, select all the code, copy it, and then paste it into this new file. Now we're going to modify this code line by line. Anywhere we have a reference to genre, we should either remove that reference or make it generic. So first we have the genre interface. We don't need it here. Delete. Then we have fetch genres response. We're going to come back to this later because the response objects we get when fetching genres and games are very similar. So let's leave it for now. Next, we should rename this function to useData. Similarly, we should rename this variable to data and the function to setData. Now, we don't want to be coupled to the genre interface. So here we should use a generic type parameter. So when defining this function in angle brackets, we add a generic type parameter and then use that type right here. Good. So we're done here. The error and isLoading variables are fine. Now, when getting data, we don't want to be coupled to an interface like fetch genres response. So here we need a generic interface. So let's rename this to fetch response. Now, instead of genre, we want to use objects of type T. And that means we should add T as a generic type parameter to this interface. Good. Now, here we have a compilation error saying generic type fetch response requires one type argument. So we define this as a generic interface that takes T as a generic type parameter. So we need to specify T here, like this. So this T is the same T that is passed to our hook up here. Okay. Next, we should get rid of the genres endpoint. So we should give this hook a parameter called endpoint of type string. And then we use that right here. Endpoint. Good. The rest is good. The final part is where we return the result. We don't want to return genres, we want to return data. Okay, so we're done with this hook. Now let's test it in our genre list component. So we go to genre list. Now, instead of use genres, we're going to use data. As a generic type argument, we supply genre. Now we don't have access to this interface because it's not exported from the use genres module. So on the top, we should export this interface, and then we can import it right here. So we call this hook and pass /genres as the endpoint. Now in the object that we get, there is no property called genres, so we should rename this to data. Now I don't like how VS Code renames these properties. We should remove that. Okay, the error is gone. Let's test our application. So back to the browser, we get the same genres as before, beautiful, but there's a problem here. The problem is that our component knows about our endpoints. This is something we want to avoid. Our components shouldn't know anything about making HTTP requests. So let's go back to use genres. So we have this interface here. Next, we have fetch genres response. We don't need this anymore because we defined this in a generic manner. So let's remove it. Also, we don't need any of the code in this function because we re-implemented this code in a generic way. So let's remove the body of this function. Instead, here we call useData. We pass genre as our generic type argument and /genres as the endpoint. So we are hiding these details behind the use genres hook. Now let's remove all these unused import statements. So we put the cursor at the end of the line, press Command and period on Mac or Control and period on Windows, and delete all unused imports. Good. So this file is nice and clean. Now back to our genre list component. We're going to replace useData with useGenres. Lovely. Everything is good. Now we should remove the unused import statement. So Command and period. It's not working. I don't know why. Let's put it on genre. Okay. Delete all unused imports. Good. Let's see if our application is still working. Lovely. refresh. Perfect. So now that we have a generic and reusable hook, we should go back and modify the hook for fetching the games. So let's go to use games. Now in this file, we have interfaces like platform and game, which we need, but we no longer need fetch games response. So delete. And also, we're going to remove the body of this hook and replace it with use data of type game. And here we pass /games. Now let's clean up our import statements. So command and period, delete. Lovely, nice and clean. Back to the browser. Our application broke. So let's look at the console tab in Chrome DevTools. So in game grid on line 25, we have an error saying cannot read, properties are undefined. Let's see what is happening here. So this is where we're mapping each game to a game card. So let's go to the game grid component. Okay, this is where we are mapping our games. The reason this is happening is because with the refactorings we applied, now we no longer have a property called games in this object, so we should rename this to data. Okay, now back to the browser. Everything is working. Refresh. Lovely. And that means it's time to commit our code. So here I'm going to say create a generic data fetching hook.